Hello and welcome to a very special episode of Out of India Theory. In today's video, we're going to be talking to Dr. Diane Hennacy Powell, who is a pioneering neuropsychiatrist, an author, researcher, and a public speaker. She earned her medical degree at the prestigious Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. She's been a faculty at Harvard. She's had a distinguished career in clinical psychiatry and published extensively. And then later she shifted her focus to psychic phenomena or paranormal phenomena. She's authored this book called the ESP Enigma, Scientific Case for Psychic Phenomena. And her most recent topic of research is telepathy and other paranormal phenomena in non-verbal autistic individuals. Dr. Diane, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Doing fine. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. So for those of you who are listening, who are, who keep up with the current internet trends, who listen to podcasts, you may be familiar with this new podcast that came in, a few months ago, called the Telepathy Tapes, in which basically they demonstrate that non-verbal autistic children show this highly accurate ability to read thoughts of their parents and friends and other people, and basically demonstrate telepathy. And Dr. Powell was involved in that. And so if you haven't checked that out, I highly recommend that podcast, because we're going to be talking about the research that happened there. And of course, Dr. Powell has done a lot of other research even outside of that podcast, going back, I think, many years, and we look into that as well. But I guess Telepathy Tapes is a good starting point to kick off this conversation today. So can you let me know exactly what your involvement was in this? How did you get involved in this, and how did you, what were you actually looking for?
Well, how it started was that I had basically tried to raise funds for a documentary over a decade ago after observing this child, a nonverbal autistic child, demonstrate this ability to, with 97% accuracy, give you the answers to questions that the therapist she was working with was thinking. And I studied her I went and studied her extensively, doing over 6 hours worth of controlled testing. And I presented it at scientific conferences, and I really wanted to have the funds to be able to go back and study her and other children like her more extensively. But it was a very expensive type of research to do, because people need to see the video to really understand what it is that I'm talking about. And I have to go to where the children live. And so there are a lot of travel expenses and lodging expenses being in a different city. And so I put it out there that I wanted to start a funding GoFundMe campaign to create a documentary. And I'd had various people approach me over the years to do the documentary, but it was when Ky Dickens approached me about 4 years ago that I thought that she was really the appropriate person to work with. I could tell that she really understood, she understood this issue from more than one level. I mean, she has an autistic brother, and she had a particular interest in autism. And I knew that she had the kind of personality that she would get along well with the families. And so I brought her on board. And so about 6 months after meeting her, she and I introduced her to some of the families who recently contacted me. She wanted to do studies with children that I hadn't met in person yet, because she wanted to see for herself just how things evolved, and she wanted to film it from the very beginning rather than go back and visit some of the children that I had studied previously. And so I introduced her to it's about four different children whose parents had just contacted me, and she filmed the experiments, and she and her film crew were just so blown away by what they witnessed that she saw this as something that really needed greater public exposure than it's gotten before this. And so she spent the next period of time creating a pitch it to the various funders for documentaries. And it was going back and forth whether or not to make it a feature film or to make it a TV series. And we, after pitching it to some of the networks who were very, very interested in it, but wanted to have their own input into it, we decided that the better way to go would be to do a feature film. And that gives it more gravitas, and you can attach impact campaigns onto that so that you can raise money for the children for whatever causes would be helpful to them, in addition to raising money for more research. So we switched gears and decided to do that. And in order to demonstrate or to test the market of, how many people are really interested in this topic, how many people, what's the public reaction going to be to what this documentary would be about,
right,
that we decided to do a podcast first. And so basically what Ky did was she took interviews with me and with scientists I introduced her to, like Dean Radin, and the testimonials of these families that I put her in touch with, and created a 10, or actually it's 11 now, episode series. And it premiered September 3rd, and by Christmas Day, it was #1 in the English-speaking world, surpassing Joe Rogan, which is what really put it on people's radar.
Were you surprised by the reaction, like how quickly it rose up the charts?
Say I was a little bit surprised. I mean, I had seen a video that was filmed by a German documentary team go viral almost a decade ago because of my research with Ramses, who is an autistic boy who could speak, and he would say what his mother was thinking. And I would use randomized stimuli that I would show the mother, and then she would say, "Okay, Ramses, what am I thinking?" And he would say, say out loud, a 4-digit number, for example. I'd given her, and that had gone viral, over 9 million views. So I knew that there was the potential for some of this research to go viral, but I also knew that it would basically draw the attention of people that are professional skeptics that are going to want to shoot it down. And so I've been wanting to still go and do more research so that we have the kind of footage that will be in the documentary that will address some of the skeptics' criticisms.
I want to ask you about the choice of the individuals, because you mentioned that it all started when you had this one experience with this nonverbal autistic kid, and then it led to more. So first of all, for people out there who don't know, is that like a special classification of autism, nonverbal? Because I found that it was repeatedly mentioned everywhere on the podcast, in the description, nonverbal autistic individuals. Is that a specially defined class, or did you choose that for a particular reason? Or would any autistic individual do, and were they children for a particular reason, or maybe in a particular age range for a reason, or was there a choice at all? And did 100% of the people you chose exhibit this power, or were there people who couldn't also?
Okay. Well, to give you some background, I became interested in autism decades ago. I went to England and studied with Sir Michael Rudder, who was knighted for his work on autism. And that was back in 1987, when autism was only 1 in 10,000 children, so it was extremely rare. And just prior to going over to study with him, I had met Oliver Sacks, who had written a case story about these autistic savants who could do these amazing feats like generate 6-digit prime numbers that they said just appeared to them. They didn't derive them or calculate them. They couldn't even do simple math. And they were uneducated, and yet at the same time, they could just tell you these consecutive prime numbers, and they could even do it. It was verified up to 12 digits, and they generated them in 20 digits, but the computers back in the 60s at this time could only generate them to 12 digits. So they were exceeding computer capacity at the time. And there were other cases in the literature of these savants, and I thought, as somebody who's a theoretician, trained neuroscientist, that this really challenges the model that we have within neuroscience about what the brain, how the brain functions, and basically what we are capable of doing. And so I decided that that was really what it was of most interest to me to study. And I had also, in my book, The ESP Enigma, which came out in 2008, I had said that I thought that autistic savants might actually be demonstrating something that's akin to ESP, because there are just so many similarities. It's that the answers come to them as a perception. And that's how a lot of people who have these psi abilities will describe what they receive. They say it feels like it's just another sense. It's another perception.
Right.
And I believe in India that in the Vedas you consider the mind to be another sense.
Yeah.
And so what happened is that one of the early people to actually get me involved with the nonverbal population was a woman named Maithili Chari, who was working for the government in India and working with these special needs children. And she had read my book, and she said, I work with savants, and she invited me over to India to meet these savants she worked with. And so I went to Chennai, and I evaluated several savants for various skills. And one of the things that I found interesting when I was over there, just as I was getting ready to leave, was that one of the parents said to me, oh, and my child's also telepathic. And I said, oh, your child's telepathic? And I said, well, that creates problems because, I mean, in terms of my assessing their savant skills, because if I'm thinking they're a mathematical savant because they're giving me the cube root of a 6-digit number, and they're just able to get that answer from my mind, for example, then I need to study that to see if that's really what's going on. And then also, within a month of coming back from India, I read about this girl named Ananda, and it was an article that was in the press saying that she could read her mother's mind, and she was a non-speaking autistic child. And I thought, okay, and one of the things that was interesting about her was that when the mother was telling, telepathically telling her what to type, the mother would say space, meaning make a space, and the child would actually type out space.
Okay.
So it gives you an idea of kind of the literal sort of, telepathy going on there. And so when I read that account and thinking about what these parents had said to me, I thought, well, I'm going to just, when I talk on podcasts or whatever, I'm going to mention that I'm really particularly interested in studying children who are autistic, who reportedly are telepathic. And then what started happening is that over the years, I would get several emails per year from a parent located somewhere, anywhere in the world, really. A lot of them in the U.S., but a lot of them in India and in Europe, where the parent would say, I had this experience with my child where I was thinking something like, oh, I really wish that I had a glass of lemonade now. And then within a minute, my autistic son is going into the kitchen and he gets a glass of lemonade and he brings it to me. And so these kind of experiences that, or I had something I didn't want to tell my child. My cousin was just diagnosed with cancer, and I'm a little upset about that, but I want to protect my child, so they wouldn't say anything, and then the child would type onto their letterboard or onto the keyboard on their computer something basically asking about the lump in this person's chest or something. It would once again be like, well, how do you know that? I'm purposely trying to not tell you about that. And so then they would start testing them and just say, hey, can you read my mind now? And the child would, and then they go, oh my gosh, I don't understand this. This really goes against my worldview. I mean, a lot of these people who contact me are doctors, teachers, psychologists, engineers, and they would go on to the internet and they would do a search to see, well, has anybody ever reported telepathy in autism? And my name would show up because of the interviews that I've done on podcasts in which I talk about it, and I wrote about it in my book. And so that's how the families come to me. It's not that I've been out there trying to recruit them. It's that I'm somebody who's a scientist who's put it out there as something that is a reported phenomenon. I'm very interested in it. I have some theoretical understanding of how this could be possible, and so that's really how it started. And the particular families, as I said earlier, that Ky focused on in the podcast are the ones who had contacted me at the time that I was working with Ky, rather than it being people that I had worked with previously, because she just wanted to make sure, she felt that would be the cleaner way to go about things, rather than something that I've known for years.
Right. That makes sense. The reason I asked is I was wondering because the kind of results that are demonstrated, at least in these 10-11 episodes on the podcast, is like so extraordinary. They're so close to being 100%, I guess. I guess you'll have the exact numbers, that I was wondering, was it 100% accuracy in 100% of the individuals you tested? Obviously you have a large group of people, of which only a few were showcased in this podcast. So do you think it's more widely prevalent, this phenomenon or this ability among autistic kids, much more than people realize, or is it in a specific subset of people and you'll have to figure out why, maybe specific family conditions or something like this? Is that an area of research?
Well, let me say that I've tested autistic individuals who are able to speak, like Ramses is one of them. But what was reported to me by the families was that the highest accuracy were these nonverbal individuals. And then what's meant by nonverbal is that these are children who have the regressive form of autism. So there's some children like Ramses who were different from birth. Okay, he started speaking at 4 months old. And he had a condition called hyperlexia. He could read as an infant, and by the time he was 5 years old, and I went to test him, he was reading college level science books.
Wow.
So that is it. And he by the age of 2, he could speak 8 different languages. So that's a very different kind of individual than the ones who are regressive.
Sorry to interrupt you, but when you say he was reading, you mean he was literally reading, or he was able to actually understand and process a higher level stuff?
Well, that's the thing that's really hard to assess.
Okay.
Because that's the thing, is that, he could read it as in he could have the book in front of him and read it out loud to you and demonstrate that he knew how to pronounce all of those words. Okay. and he would spit information back at you, that sounds like a little, encyclopedia. I mean, one of the nicknames that used to be given to these types of savants is little professors, because they can be, that they're just so precocious in terms of their knowledge, what they talk about. But in terms of trying to understand what it is that he really grasped, I suspect that he didn't really grasp a lot of the nuances that are involved in the English language. And I mean, that's one of the things that autistic individuals have, is they have something quirky about their language abilities. And so it's much harder to have a conversation with the types of savants or autistic children like Ramsey, because he couldn't do what we're doing right now. I can't ask him a question and then get back an answer that is his generating the answer on his own, thinking about what you're really trying to understand. So language is a form of communication.
Right.
Instead, the kind of dialogue that you can have with him is more like, Ramses, can you recite pi to the 100th digit? And then he'll just go ahead and recite pi the 100th digit for you. So he understands what that means, and his ability to do mathematics and manipulate numbers showed that he really truly understood mathematics. So he had an intellectual capacity that showed that he demonstrated to me that he had a high school, if not college level understanding of math, and the branches of science like astronomy, where it's just a matter of memorizing a bunch of numbers, like, these are the different galaxies out there, and these are the different planets in the solar system, and what their cycle is, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Spitting out a bunch of facts is easy, and I really do believe he understands what those facts are, but in terms of level of comprehension, if he were to have read like a philosophy book or read a piece of literature and discuss it the way that somebody in an upper level English class would know, I suspect not, because of his autism.
Okay.
And so that's one type of autistic savant. Then the nonverbals are these children who were developing completely normally, and then at the time that they're acquiring language, which for most children, I mean, that's really starting to take off when they're between the ages of say 15 months and 30 months. Most children are speaking by the time they're 3 years old, and they're still babbling when they're less than one, or they're not articulating very well. And so that very critical time period when you're acquiring the ability to express language is a time period in which these children become ill as a result of something. They get a many of them, it's that they get sick, and there's a variety of different ways that they get sick, but they get sick and their immune system is overactivated, and the immune system in the brain is involved in the sculpting process, what we call pruning of the brain, which is actually how the wiring for a lot of these different skills is shaped, basically. And so what happens is if something happens to disrupt development during the acquisition of a task, and your brain is still really, it's in its really most pliable, what we call plastic phases. If that's when it happens, then workarounds get created so that it's not as devastating in terms of your ability to do something if the insult to the brain occurs when you are young, which is different from when you've been around for 50, 60 years and you have a stroke, I mean, that's your brain is just so baked in that way of being, you're not going to be able to recover that skill as easily. So what happens with these nonverbal children is that the area of their brain that gets affected is the part of the brain that's in the expression of speech, but the area of the brain that is in the comprehension of speech is still intact. And so what's happening is that these parents are blown away by the fact that the child is still learning just like any child would be learning.
Right.
It's just that they haven't had a means by which they could demonstrate what they've learned.
Right.
And so, what a lot of people don't understand is that area of the brain, that the motor area of the brain that controls the mouth, okay, also has a hand up there. Okay, they're very close to one another. It's like the homunculus in the brain has his hand up there. And so what's happening is that the mouth and the hand are actually treated both as tools.
Mm.
It's part of the brain that's involved in tool using. And so if you think about it, it's language is a tool.
Right.
It's a fine motor skill to be able to articulate this apparatus that we have and then produce a sound. And it's a fine motor skill to be able to use your hand to type or to, or to make something. And so that's the part that's compromised. And that's how, unfortunately, we tend to judge people's intelligence and cognitive abilities based on what they can do with their mouth and their hand. And so what happens with these children is that their parents are usually very educated individuals who really are passionate about their child getting an education. And they have this sense that the child is smarter than people think the child is. And so they eventually stumble upon this form of communication that was actually developed by an Indian woman named Soma, in which you're compensating for their poor coordination by making it that the communication requires larger muscle groups. Okay, so instead of the fine motor skills that you have when you're typing on a keyboard, they're doing more gross movements,
right.
With their arm like this, and so they're able to point to a letter or eventually point to a key on a keyboard. And so when the parents started having the child work with a therapist who does that kind of training, or they themselves took it on, particularly during the pandemic, they eventually start to see, once the child is expressing their thoughts on the communication device, they start to see, oh my gosh, this kid actually knows what I'm thinking. And
right.
And so that's when I'm talking about the nonverbal. And what I suspect, because they seem to have the most profound accuracy, and a lot of the other, don't get me wrong, the other ones can do this and they're fairly accurate. The difference is that with the nonverbals, you can test them for longer strings. It's exhausting for these kids to do, especially if they can speak, to do this. And it's as though they have to, what you're asking of them is you're asking them to, I believe it's a right hemisphere skill, that they're accessing information using their brain differently, and yet at the same time you're wanting them to communicate using another left brain skill. And so that's one way to think of it in terms of what you're asking them to do. But the other thing is that they also describe that they don't that it's hard for them to feel their body. That nonverbals will say to you, they have very poor proprioception, and so they oftentimes don't know where their hand is in space. And so it's a lot of effort for them to be connected with their body enough to use their body to communicate. Yet at the same time, you're asking them to be less in the body to access the thoughts of someone else. I mean, it's really, when you think about what it is we're asking them to do, it's really quite remarkable. And what you see is some of them are, well, I'd say that the ones who the parents contact me, the majority of them are fairly rapid at doing it by the time they contact me. And they're just pointing like this. And when it's a random digit that you give them, when you say, okay, I want, this, think of as you give them a 6-digit random number, the kid's not hesitating to find out where to put their finger. They're going like this.
Right.
But sometimes what I would say is sometimes the kid, because we're asking them to do such an amazing task, sometimes the kid will make a mistake. They realize they made a mistake. They realize it right away, and then they get frustrated and they don't want to do it anymore. A lot of them are very perfectionistic.
Right. Now, before I get into the telepathy and the extraordinary part of it, I just wanted to quickly ask you, because I did read about this mode of, I think it's called RPM. I forget the full form of it. Rapid something.
Prompting method.
Okay.
Rapid prompting method. That's what was developed by Soma.
Right. And I did read that it's kind of slightly controversial in that mainstream, like academics and mainstream practitioners kind of look down upon it for some reason. So can you tell us why it is deemed unreliable, like really quickly by the mainstream practitioners? And also, I'd imagine, how useful can it be for more complex communication? I mean, I could probably I point out numbers or say, hello, how are you, blah, blah, whatever, write out a sentence. But then to have a day-to-day conversation, it must be incredibly, like you said, taxing and complicated to use that method, right?
Right. Well, so I think, first of all, part of the problem with the controversy over RPM is that a lot of people they're not neurologists who understand the brain. And so there's this perception that these are parents who just haven't wanted to believe that their child is as disabled as the system tells them that their child is. And so they think that it's a lot of the wishful thinking on the part of the parent, because these children were, after they regressed, the parents are told, don't expect much of your child. You can institutionalize them if you want, kind of thing. And they're like, no, I don't want to institutionalize my child. But the system really has a very dismal view of these children, and most of them are diagnosed by pediatricians who really don't have the training in developmental neuropsychiatry that I do. And so they don't realize that it's kind of, for them, it's like hard for them to imagine that you have this child who has that level of language capability that they haven't been taught in a school setting, the documented school setting, going through the grades like everybody else has.
Right.
So that's part of it, is that perception issue. Part of it is that before RPM was developed, there was something called FC, and FC was facilitated communication, where you would have the caregiver kind of support the child's wrist, oftentimes. Okay, so that they're providing basically a physical support for the child, and then they're letting the child sort of move. Move. They're trying to follow where the child wants to go. And so then, pointing to, letters to communicate. And there's lots of problems with that because, it's like, that is when people say it's like a Ouija board, it's like, yeah, that is like a Ouija board. Because you just could have all kinds of subtle things going on there. And so I remember when FC first came out, I also could understand why people just thought that it was, people being wishful, for what that is. But when I saw RPM, it's a different, it just is a different animal. And yet it gets lumped into the same thing.
Right.
And I think that's really unfortunate. And what I mean by it being a different animal is that even if the parent initially starts off with providing physical support, the children that I am willing to test are the ones that don't have any touch at all, that the parent has some distance from them, and they're able to do all of that pointing on their own. What you still have is a person holding the letterboard for them.
Right.
And it's really hard to get these children to use a letterboard that is just, tacked onto the wall, or, put in a stand. And I don't really understand that entirely, why that is, but that is the case. The parents and teachers will tell you that it would take a while to work towards that. The reason why I think that some of these kids would be able to work towards that is because I've actually seen it, where I've seen children that progress from doing RPM and doing it enough over time that their motor, it's like occupational therapy, their motor skills get better and better. Oftentimes there's visual motor coordination where they don't just need to have the motor skills and know where their hand is in space. They also need to be able to focus in on the keyboard and see the letters, because a lot of these kids have visual issues as well. And so I've seen children who started out with RPM progress onto typing independently on a keyboard. And so my attitude is, why not assume that could be possible for all of these kids and give them the opportunity to do this as a form of therapy rather than just lump it in with FC and treat it as though it's all wishful thinking. Because it's just because a child's language expression is disrupted, as I said, the rest of their mind can be the rest of them can be intact. So it's really more of an issue of their mind-body connection, and in this case, it's a disconnection.
Right.
And another thing I want to say, though, is that I think that one of my theories is that, and this is getting into a philosophical thing. I don't know that there's a way to prove this, but philosophically, I think that these children, what they're showing us is that they had their identification with their body as self disrupted at such a young age before they develop a sense of self, that they never leave that sort of unitary consciousness that we all have before we become super identified with the Maya, the body as self, and the story of our life as life itself.
Wow, yeah, this is actually, I wanted to get into that a little later, but then it's good that this is a nice segue into that section. So I was wondering, how does telepathy, where is the emergence of the psi phenomena in this? Because it's not just telepathy, and I believe they also, at least from the podcast, they also saw people like ghosts. They got messages from other dimensions. And so where does this phenomena emerge from? Because this is where I think we sort of go away from our day-to-day scientific rational, understanding into into something more fantastic.
When you say where does it emerge from, I'm not sure I understand, exactly what you mean by that. But
like, I feel like there's a little gap in, like for example, you explained, how there is a dissociation from the body, how, things happen in the brain in these kids. But then how are they able to then communicate? There's like a little leap of faith that I'm having to do here. Like, from here, how did we get there? How are these fantastic outcomes happening? Where they're able to like read the numbers, multiple digit numbers in the minds of their parents. Or, I believe some girl, I think, was able to, in one of the episodes, I forget which episode, she was able to crack the password of another woman, like a computer password. So that's like a significant leap. Like, how did we get from here to here? Like, how are these things possible? I don't know if I'm...
Well, yeah, I understand what you're saying. I mean, so first of all, let me just preface this with the fact that I've only done controlled experiments around the telepathy, and so these other claims that are made in the podcast are not ones that I've been able to experimentally test.
Okay.
And some of them are more difficult to test than others. But one of the things that I'm doing is I'm setting up experiments between children who are both nonverbal autistics, and putting them in separate rooms and asking them to be sending random stimuli to one another, because then I can get around the controversy over the type of communication device they're using. Because if they and their communication partner are both blind to what the target being sent is, then it doesn't matter that it's them as a pair doing this, and so it's a way of enabling getting around that problem where the child needs more support because of the issues with their body, but they still can demonstrate the telepathy with someone that they are close with, that they have some kind of bond with. And so I'm actually, that's my way of testing out this whole concept of the hill and them being telepathic with one another. Some of the other claims that have come in are ones in which there was somebody who had already contacted me, say a teacher or a parent, saying that their child, was demonstrating what they thought was mind reading, and they already sort of knew me. And then what happened is then they have an experience months or maybe a year later or whatever, in which their nonverbal child types something about, your Uncle George is in the corner there, and he's got a message for you from heaven. And, and it's like, well, Uncle George died before the kid was even born, or they're talking about the Uncle George of the speech therapist, which there's no way this kid would know about.
Right.
And so it's just the spontaneous demonstration of mediumship, basically. And there are experimental protocols that have been used to test mediumship by a couple of different institutes here in the U.S. I mean, the Forever Family Foundation tests and certifies mediums, and another one is Windbridge Institute. Julie Beischel. I mean, she's studied mediumship, and Gary Schwartz at the University of Arizona has studied mediumship, and so there are people who've been certified as mediums, and they've undergone controlled studies. So just wanted to make sure the audience knew that. But I myself haven't done those kind of studies yet with these children. Now, how do we theoretically get from that to how do we understand this phenomena? And I think that for me, the best way to think about it is to really invoke other dimensions. I think that what we're talking about here is what people call non-local consciousness. This idea that we're really more interconnected than we realize, and that we have access to information that is outside of this particular point in space-time.
Right.
And so any deceased individual would exist, and there, that whatever that time period, that space-time section, when they existed, that they're eternally there.
Right. Sorry to interrupt you, but this is this strange gray area of overlap between neuroscience and psychiatry and psychology, I guess, with quantum mechanics and still largely unproven or maybe unprovable concepts of, like, I mean, I guess when it comes to like particles at the quantum level, yes, there is entanglement and non-locality, but then exactly how does it apply to consciousness and biology at such a macro level? There's so much of question marks there, but I guess that would be, yeah, I think I understand what you're getting at. I remember this very interesting talk that I listened to, like a TED talk by Russell Targ, the physicist who was describing non-locality, and he was talking about psi phenomena as, because I remember people talking about telepathy as some sort of mental radio waves, as if, like there was an example where a lady whose tooth filling sort of, I think, detected radio waves, and she could hear signals in her brain, and somehow they thought of it as some kind of a radio waves. But then Russell Targ in this TED talk was arguing that any form, if you imagine it as any form of a radio wave of anything, which is electromagnetic in nature, it would be constrained by the speed of light, and it can't travel faster than the speed of light. But then in telepathy, the transference or the thought transference is near instantaneous. And I guess theoretically, if I was here and somebody at the other end of the galaxy, or maybe even at a really large distance at another point on Earth, I guess that thought transference, the point he was making is almost near instantaneous, in a way faster. How can signals travel faster than the speed of light? And that's where he was bringing in the whole idea of non-locality and how space itself, the way we think of it, is imaginary and is not real. I thought that'll be a good thing to consider here, like the whole thing about quantum entanglement and.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, I've been thinking along those lines for decades. I have a brother who's a theoretical physicist, and I have been working on a theory of consciousness with him, and so he's an expert in AI as well, and so we have a lot of interesting conversations, and I've spoken at the Science of Consciousness conference that Stu Hameroff has been behind for, I first spoke at it back in 2005, and Stu Hameroff is the person he's the anesthesiologist at the University of Arizona who came up with a theory for consciousness with Roger Penrose.
Okay.
That it evokes, quantum processes. So that's and thinking of savants as having brains that demonstrate that we don't just have classical processing in our brain. We also have quantum processing. So that's very much the waters that I've been swimming in. Yet at the same time, I'm also aware of the fact that you can't lump all of these things together and evoke and necessarily, you shouldn't necessarily do that and evoke the same mechanism for everything. So what I mean by that is, first of all, when people say that telepathy is instantaneous, it's like, and faster than light, well, what's the evidence that it's instantaneous? I mean, when you think about, there's a delay between when the parent is thinking, and I show her the number, and there's a lot of delay between. It's not that it's a long delay, but it's enough of a delay that you can't say, oh, it's instantaneous. I haven't been able to measure that. That's one of the reasons why I'm interested in getting EEGs, simultaneous EEGs of the mother and the child, to see if there's a synchronization and if that is, instantaneous. Okay, because these accounts of, oh, my brother died, halfway across the world at the same time that I woke up. Well, that still could have been traveling at the speed of light.
Right.
Because, nobody's there with a stopwatch. So when I look at what's happening between this, let's say just parent and child, it's very interesting to think that, perhaps thoughts can, that thoughts create, a wave, okay, and we live in this very ionic world, an electromagnetic world, and we've got a huge electromagnetic generator in our heart and in our brain, and so, to think that sending out that electromagnetic signal, and that it could have that thought encoded in it some way. And it may be more of the magnetic component that's involved in this than the electrical component.
Right.
And we use magnetism as a way of recording things. And so if you think of it as there's this magnetism out there, we live in, and that you have these thoughts that then this child is picking up that information from within this magnetosphere, for lack of a better word. And I mean, we have all of these components. We have magnetism receptors,
right,
in the back of our eyes. We have magnetite in the membranes of our brain and in our brain ourselves, but it's really concentrated in the membranes of our brain and in some very strategic bones in the skull. And the nose. And so if you look at the, that tells you that magnetism, plays a role in consciousness.
Mm.
And these children have extraordinary auditory capacity. They, oftentimes they have, their visual acuity may not be good because their eyes don't necessarily coordinate very well together. But a lot of these kids have perfect pitch, and they can hear things at a distance. They've got super hearing, and so then and a lot of them have got pattern recognition skills that are amazing. That they can hear something and then sit down and play it. So if you realize that that's really the nature of a lot of these savant gifts, then to think that they're somehow reading the patterns within a magnetosphere makes sense to me. I mean, there's somehow information is not encoded. I don't think it's encoded in our brain. I think it's encoded in a field, in a
right.
consciousness, and that these kids are really good at decoding it.
Right. But I just have to, but I do have to quickly play the devil's advocate here, because I remember, I don't know, was it in this podcast or somewhere, but I think they tried the experiment in a Faraday cage. I remember reading somewhere where it excludes fields, and they were still able to get results. So the thing about Faraday cages, and this is the reason why when people evoke the Faraday cage as evidence that it's entanglement, I have to disagree with them. Because in a Faraday cage, a compass still works. And so the magnetic field of the Earth is not being blocked. And I believe that the telepathy is more associated with the magnetic field, but also that it's in those frequencies that are the Schumann frequencies, which are, the frequencies that are, they're less than 30 hertz. Right.
They're what are considered extremely low frequencies. And so the Faraday cages block everything but extremely low frequencies. But if you look at the brain waves of people on their EEG, what frequencies are they running in? When we're in dream sleep, what frequencies are we running in? that is in the lower registers, and that's not going to be blocked by a Faraday cage. So then the reason, the rationale that they give for, oh, well, it can't be that, is that extremely low frequencies don't have the resolution needed. But extremely low frequencies were what were used by the military to communicate with submarines. And so those frequencies are capable of carrying enough information that they were able to use them to be in contact with submarines underneath all of that water. And so the point is that I would need to see I would need to see the experiments done where you even have the extremely low frequencies blocked, and for me to say it's 100% got to be entanglement, or I'd need to see some kind of measurement of instantaneous, both people's EEGs, or just it's like that,
right?
Not even a fraction of a second, because instantaneous is instantaneous.
Yeah. Wow. So all this means lots of funding income necessary. And do you think this is something that has changed with this whole podcast becoming popular? And do you think it'll be easier to attract funding to do this kind of research with the kind of interest that is generated?
Yeah, I do. I mean, that was one of the reasons for doing it. It's not to publicly declare that we've proven anything, although Ky is 100% convinced. But I'm the scientist who's, really, I'm holding, I have to hold the standard up, to what science is going to need. Yeah, absolutely. I think the timing is better now. See, when I wrote my book 17 years ago, I mean, it's still totally current. It's still relevant. I mean, in terms of what the information is there, but it was a little bit before its time. And similarly, when I first started doing these studies on these autistic kids, people just weren't ready for that. I really don't think. And so what's happened is that now people are ready for it. I think that there's just, I think some of that is, that people who grew up with Harry Potter and that kind of thing, people who've, they're at the prime years now, they're in their 30s, and they're movers and shakers right now. And so some of it's that and other media exposure that has really prepared people for a cultural shift. It was just, so I think there's been a lot of groundwork that's been laid down that has made this more of a something that I think is really just tipping things over, okay, such that now it's going to hopefully get more funding and be considered a respectable, eventually become a respectable area of research.
Right. It's really fascinating you mentioned this. It's almost like a cycle, because I feel like we've sort of gone through this age of materialism, and now it's the end of the age of materialism. We are going back to appreciating the unseen realms and dimensions, and sort of a tolerance for magic and things like that in the cultural attitude. So I guess that makes it much more easier to for these ideas to permeate and find acceptance, I guess. I have a lot of, I made a whole list of bunch of questions to talk about, to ask you, but I think we're already running out of time, so it's such a shame. But I do want to sort of bring this to a conclusion, like what are the implications of this discovery? I guess on a personal level, like you said, Ky is 100% convinced, and maybe people are on a personal level, the parents are already convinced. But then the moment as a scientist, as an academic, you manage to prove it, what are the implications for humanity, do you think? Like, I do know that at some point, well, I'm considering the extreme. For example, the CIA did all these mind control experiments and sort of tried to weaponize, using remote viewing and everything to spy on people, and to use these powers for in warfare and things like that. Imagine if you're able to crack passwords and stuff like this. What does it mean, not just for autistic individuals, but for the rest of humanity? If people find that it's an acquirable, learnable skill.
Well, I think that first of all, there's so many of these children. I mean, if what they're saying is true, that they're all telepathic, okay, that's and it suggests to me that, and this is another one of my theories, that we all are telepathic when we first are born. Okay, we all have a shared consciousness with our mother, whose womb we developed in. Okay, and there is this way in which an infant and a mother are still interconnected with one another. That you can see that there's been studies shown on that. And what I suspect is that we all have that as an innate ability, but then when we acquire language and we become more and more identified, the ego develops and we become more and more identified with this identity and with the body and using language as our way of being in the world, that we forget about the telepathy, which I think actually played a role in our acquisition of language itself. They played a role in how the infant understands what these sounds, these complex patterns of sounds, actually mean, and how that connects to someone else's thoughts. So I think that one point I want to make is that I think that we all innately have had these skills and can develop them to some degree. Number two implication is that we are all interconnected. We live in a world where we are interconnected, and that our thoughts, even if someone's not perceiving our thoughts the way that these children can perceive thoughts, that our thoughts are that they have a role in being out there in terms of the larger collective consciousness field. That we need to be more mindful of what our thoughts are. We need to be more that we're contributing to this greater consciousness field and having more of an impact than people tend to think. They tend to think, oh, well, those were my thoughts, and nobody else had access to them. Therefore, they're not having an impact. Well, right. It suggests that those thoughts don't just stay, within a confined area, and they can have an impact. And then thirdly, the message that all of these children are giving is a message of love, a message of we really need to be kinder to one another. And so so what's happening is that simultaneous with people starting to embrace the idea that telepathy could be real, people are getting this message of how important it is to be loving, and that there is that our lives are not just that what the materialist model tells us, that when we die that we no longer exist, that actually that maybe there really is something like karma, maybe there really is some eternity of the soul, such that you once again have to be more mindful of what you are doing when you have the privilege of being embodied.
Right.
And then the fact that all of these cultures, and particularly like the indigenous cultures that I've worked with, they believe that our ancestors are always there to support us, but also watching what we're doing. And so then there's and that and we're supposed to be thinking about our future generations. And so it puts our incarnation into a perspective where we need to be thinking more about both the past and the future, okay, and acting in the moment. And then in terms of these children being exploited by, people that have nefarious intentions, these children just won't cooperate. They won't, and they're numerous. I mean, one in 30 children are diagnosed with autism now, and a quarter of those have the nonverbal form.
Wow.
So we probably have 1 million of these children at least in the U.S. alone. And so it's not one of those things where, I'm a scientist who's working with just a small cadre of children that, they would just need to swoop in and take those children away. And it's not that at all. It's that I get, I've gotten emails from people from all around the world that say, the kid can do this, and I'm glad that somebody's studying it, because it blew their mind when they first witnessed it.
Wow. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, because it's very interesting, because from a very scientific academic interpretation of the world, it's interesting how we moved into a very philosophical outlook, and a lot of the things you said towards the end makes a lot of sense to me, especially since I come from a very Hindu tradition background, with which, ideas like karma and, the ancestors and everything. So it makes sense. But I can understand how that would make an academic who's reviewing your paper for a peer-reviewed journal make very, very uncomfortable. But yeah, so anyway, thank you so much for sharing your views. Unfortunately, we'll have to wrap up this conversation, even though we have tons of things pending. So thank you so much for coming on the channel, and thanks for all the work, and all the best for your future work.
Thank you very much.